Welcome, everyone, to our Packers News Camp Chat virtually alongside Tom Silverstein. I am Olivia Reiner. The Packers officially begin their first real activity portion of camp tomorrow with the acclimation period. And today we heard from head coach Matt LaFleur and general manager Brian Gutekunst about the status of the team in the midst of the pandemic going into this upcoming week. However, before we discuss what they had to say, I want to remind you, as always, get to be a part of our conversation. Head on over to the Facebook comments or the YouTube comments. Leave us a question, leave us a general thought you're having, and we will get to some of those toward the end of our conversation. Tom, the Packers veterans officially completed their initial intake portion of training camp this past week, and this upcoming week, as I mentioned, they'll begin the acclimation period, which includes strength and conditioning and walkthroughs. However, as we know, it's going to look quite a bit different than training camps in the past. I asked Matt LaFleur, generally speaking, what are some of the challenges heading in to the acclimation period? And he referenced something that happened just the other day as the rookies had their first walkthrough of training camp. He said that typically when he's calling the team into the huddle at the line of scrimmage during walkthroughs, that they get into a really tight circle. However, now that exactly is not approved, I guess I could say, just during the pandemic, getting in close. So now they have to do things a little bit looser, mitigate some of that risk on the field. What other challenges are the Packers facing going back to the facility in this acclimation period?
Well, I think the challenges are going to change every single day as they figure out new ways to combat the virus. They're going to have to learn from when they get positive tests, as Brian Gutekunst said, he's expecting there to be positive tests, and some of them, maybe all of them, won't be because of poor decisions off the field. But I think it's sort of what society has to look like in a pandemic, which is that everybody wears a mask, everybody tries to keep away from each other as best as possible, and you limit human contact. And that's the only way that we know to limit this virus. And when you're talking about football players whose number one objective is close contact, or that is what they do. Being safe, you've got to control the factors that you can.
They're certainly doing their best, whether it's building plexiglass shields in between lockers in the locker room, or it's spreading out some of these meeting rooms. We were told today that the media room is no longer for the media, as the media will no longer be present inside of the facility. At least most of us won't be. Now it's the offensive line meeting room. So
Yeah, I don't know how they're going to fit in those seats because they're really uncomfortable. But anyway.
narrow and uncomfortable might not be conducive to offensive linemen bodies. That being said, President and CEO Mark Murphy said that the weak link in the NFL's protocols returning to the facilities these upcoming weeks is when the players go home. Players can be fined for reckless behavior, which reportedly includes doing things like going to an indoor nightclub or going to an indoor bar. How do the Packers encourage their players, who are adults, to hold each other accountable during this time?
Well, I think that's a big part of it is community pressure. And, I asked Gutekunst about this, whether he would have a zero tolerance policy for someone who breaks the rules and tests positive, or just breaks the rules. And he said he was hoping that the peer pressure from the locker room, from the veterans, would be enough to make someone think about the decisions they make off the field, because all it takes is one person to create a super spreader, what they call a super spreader situation, which is what we've seen with Miami Marlins, St. Louis Cardinals now. The virus is going to get into the building, You can't stop it. But what you can do is limit it. And the more you can limit it with all the testing and things like that, you're just uh, trying to avoid an epidemic so that it spreads to multiple people at once.
These protocols in the facility, outside of the facility, are new for the team, for the players, and for the coaches, everybody. In addition, the actual structure of training camp and the preseason is going to look a lot different too, with the elimination of a preseason. The NFL and the NFLPA came to that agreement to get rid of preseason games in favor of having a longer ramp up period, a longer acclimation period, so the players aren't at risk of greater injury as they get back out of quarantine and into the facility. Now that means that rookies like quarterback Jordan Love won't have those live in-game reps to prove himself out on the field early on, as the Packers are getting to know him early in his career. How is the team planning on trying to replicate those live rep opportunities in practice?
Yeah, well, let me preface all of that by saying I think this is a redshirt year for almost every rookie around the NFL. Only the ones who are way ahead, with football IQ and just have a knack, or they're so physically gifted that they can figure out a way to overcome mistakes. I just think you're going to be hard pressed to play a rookie in the early part of the season. To answer your question, LaFleur said, and Gutekunst said, that they will have more live contact than they've had. They generally have no live contact in training camp. So this is going to harken back to the Forrest Gregg days when they tackled and had goal line stands. And I think they have to do that type of stuff. You can't just throw a guy into a game after not tackling at all and expect him to both, mentally handle it and physically. So he also said they probably will do a scrimmage inside Lambeau Field, a live scrimmage or a couple. So I think those are ways they're going to try to do that. Also, they're going to put the younger players in really high pressure situations. They're going to have special periods to put them in positions where they might find themselves during the season.
Players, undrafted players that are going to have a little bit more added discomfort when it comes to the Packers making more decisions with the roster, simply because they don't have as much time and opportunity to prove themselves in front of their coaches. The Packers have until August 16th to cut the roster down to 80 men. Currently, the roster technically sits at 83 because they have 4 players on the COVID reserve list, including tight end Jay Sternberger and kicker Mason Crosby. General Manager Brian Gutekunst said today that he's going to be playing the capacity of the roster by ear. He could decide to cut down to 80 closer to the start of the getting in pads and just closer to that August 16th date, or it could happen sooner. Why is Gutekunst choosing to play it by ear as opposed to cutting down a little bit earlier, because they can only have up to 80 at most in the facility at one time?
I think they always lean towards evaluating personnel and waiting as long as they can to evaluate personnel. And, the way they bring guys in and out and switch spots, even during training camp, they do that, bring guys in late or even in the middle of camp. I think they just want to get a feel for who these guys are during this first 2 weeks. There's no advantage to having them all together because all they're doing is strength and conditioning and some walkthroughs. And they're going to have the veterans will all be together in the 45-man group, and then probably all the rookies and fringe guys coming off injuries will be in the other group. And so you'll be able to, I think it's actually an advantage for LaFleur that he can have all the rookies together in a concentrated amount so that they can tailor that portion differently than they do the group with the veterans.
General Manager Brian Gutekunst has also shown his willingness to play around with the roster heading into that August 16th cut-down date because he has signed another player. He's added a player off of waivers in halfback, fullback John Lovett. They were awarded the former Chiefs player through the waiver wire process. The pandemic has impacted the speed at which players can not only get to Green Bay, but also do their physicals. How active will Brian Gutekunst be when it comes to searching the waiver wire and potentially adding some pieces to his roster this preseason?
Well, I think there's two different type of guys that you can consider. One is someone who's been in a camp and just got cut, and someone who's been out of the game. Because I think they're, and I haven't verified this yet, but I believe I saw it somewhere, that if you've got a guy who was in a camp yesterday and he was tested, and you pick him up on waivers, and you can get him to the facility for another test, that you can bring him into practice pretty quickly. But if you get somebody who has not been getting daily tested, there's a 4-day process you have to go through to get cleared. And so it doesn't do you any good to bring one of those guys in. It's going to be really hard for people on the street who are looking for jobs. And the Packers have landed guys like that. They've gotten guys on the roster who were signed late into training camp, who made the 53-man roster. So I just think, you have to know the talent that you're bringing in. As Gutekunst said, you have to have a really good sense of who you're bringing in and his fit. And then, hope that the testing goes, they allow guys to come in immediately who are on other teams.
Navigating the pandemic during this time was also an issue during free agency. However, the Packers were able to bring in a few free agent signings, including wide receiver Devin Funchess. However, it was announced recently that Funchess has decided to opt out of the 2020 season due to coronavirus concerns. General Manager Brian Gutekunst today said that no other player that he knows of at the moment has decided to opt out besides Funchess. How likely is it that the Packers will look outside of their current roster for wide receivers help?
Again, I think that'll be someone who has been on a roster and ends up getting cut, or a trade. I still think there's plenty of opportunity to make trades. That's one way you can get a guy in immediately. So I think what you might see are teams saying, hey, we're going to cut this guy. Are you interested? Or call around the league, and maybe they swap guys, swap undrafted free agents just so they can get them into camp. So we might see a bunch of trades like that. I think he has to be on the lookout, and a lot will depend on the performance of the wide receivers in camp. They'll evaluate it. They constantly evaluate it every day. And then we'll see, if there's anybody who gets cut. And, typically there's a receiver somewhere who gets cut, and it's, who wants him the most.
Regardless of whether or not they decide to bring in a wide receiver from outside, the current wide receivers on the roster certainly have a lot of opportunity ahead of them in training camp this season. Let's get into some of these questions over on YouTube and Facebook. Thank you, everyone, for submitting one. If you haven't already, get them in now. I'll be scrolling around looking for some good questions. We'll start with John, a rare YouTube comment. We don't get too many YouTube viewers. I know the bulk of our viewership comes from Facebook, so thanks for joining us, John. John asks a really good question, one that I've myself have been pondering quite a bit. What happens if a whole position group gets sick at once? The Packers certainly don't want to be down a whole position group. You need all of the position groups to be able to field a team for a game when we start getting into the season here. Tom, what happens if, God forbid, an entire offensive line room gets sick, or even, the quarterbacks? What would happen in that case?
I think it'll be just like baseball. The game will be suspended. They won't be able to play it. And you'll wait another week and maybe move on. That game's canceled, and maybe you move on to the schedule with no makeup. I just think that's the only way they're going to be able to do it. I don't think you can go into a game with 5 practice squad guys protecting Aaron Rodgers. I just don't think you would do that. And so I think they would rather um, probably just postpone it. I don't know. You could say, well, okay, we'll start Jordan Love in this game, or Tim Boyle, and sit Rodgers out. But your goal is to make the playoffs and get to the Super Bowl, and you don't want to take a loss. So I think they have contingency plans for something like that. But I really do think we're going to see canceled games. I think we'll see canceled weeks. I think there'll be weeks when there are no games. And, if they make it through the season, that'll be a miracle, really, in my estimation. I'm writing something about that Monday for Tuesday. And, I just think the risk factor is really high.
The way baseball has been handling it with the MLB has been largely day to day, and I assume that, at least for now, the Packers and the NFL are going to handle it the same exact way. Thank you, John, for your question. Let's move on to Linda, who asks a question that is going to affect both of us, Spoon. She asks, will we be able to view live practices? The Packers have designated, and not just the Packers, I should say, it's the NFL has designated certain groups that are eligible to view practices and be present in practices. And media is making up a very small portion of those practices. It sounds like about 10 individuals in tier 2M will be allowed to be present at practices, and I believe in the facility in certain designated areas. And then there's a separate tier 3, that is going to be made up of not only some media members, some overflow media, but also some team personnel like scouts, doctors. So that's going to be a mixed group. Tier 3, I believe, is about 30 people in total, which means for all of you that there's just going to be fewer people covering these practices. Tom, what's your understanding of what capacity will be able to cover these practices, and especially in in a live capacity?
Yeah, so basically, the NFL and NFLPA have said no more than 40 people, non football personnel, are allowed to watch practice. Now, it's a little uneven because the Packers have the kind of facility where they could have many more people watching and still maintain social distancing. But they've got to have some uniformity, I assume, throughout the league. And what they're saying is they'll have 10 spots where reporters can walk the sidelines. They will be tested every day. They'll be tested the same way the players are. And they have to pass 3 tests in 4 days, and then are tested every day after that. They must wear masks everywhere they go, and they are allowed to go into certain parts of the facility, basically just the media rooms. The rest can sit in the stands at Reiner Field and watch with masks on, but it's limited. It's limited to 30 people. And I think of those 10 people who have the full access, 4 are going to be people from national outlets. So there will only be like 6 local reporters down on the field. But we'll be able to tweet all the action. So you'll be able to follow us on our live blog as normal. There should be no shortage of information coming out of the camp. Maybe not as much volume. If there's a shortage, it won't be volume, but you should be getting all the pertinent information from every practice.
I think it's a good time to remind you all, if you're not subscribed to Packers News or the Journal Sentinel or the Press Gazette, now would be a good time, because we know we will be able to actually be there present covering the team. Where else are you going to get better coverage than that? I think that sounds pretty good. Thank you, Linda, for your question. We're getting a lot of questions about Everson Griffin, the Vikings former Vikings, I should say, defensive lineman. There was a report earlier this week that the Packers had some interest in Griffin. Tom, I'm curious how likely, how good of a fit would Griffin be if the Packers were potentially interested in bringing him on?
Yeah, when I first heard that, I wondered whether the Packers had called and Griffin decided he's still considering going back to Minnesota, whether his agent tried to use that as a ploy to get Minnesota to pony up, like they're not going to want him playing in the division, so you better pay what we're asking. So that was my first inclination. I think he would be a decent fit. I do think he's a better player on turf than he is on grass, and so he fits the Vikings' needs. Also, he's not really a 3-4 end. He's more of a 4-3 end, but the Packers play a lot of 4-3 on nickel situations. He'd be a really good addition. I just don't know that they can afford it. I mean, the question is, are you going to spend that money on him, or are you going to spend that money on David Bakhtiari or Aaron Jones or Corey Linsley? I think in the end, they're going to spend it on the guys they got.
Right. And even heading into next year, as we discussed with Brian Gutekunst, with the cap tentatively at a bare minimum, unadjusted cap at $175 million next year. The Packers at the moment would roll over somewhere around $12 million in cap space to next year, which would add a little bit more money, but still they're drastically under what they anticipated the cap to be next season, and they
Right.
have a lot of 2021 free agents, as you mentioned. Do they want to spend that cap space on those free agents, potentially
What?
locking down players like defensive lineman Kenny Clark, tackle David Bakhtiari, center Corey Linsley, running back Aaron Jones, cornerback Kevin King? It's a very big list, and it's a big question. We'll see exactly what they decide to do.
Well, and the other thing is that are you going to spend that money and give a big signing bonus and then the season's canceled? And then all of a sudden you haven't gotten anything out of him, and he's a year older next year. You could see Seattle made a huge trade for Jamal Adams with the New York Jets, but he's 24 years old. Everson Griffin is in the twilight of his career, so you have to be really careful with veteran guys. If you pay them a decent amount next year, and then the season, you don't get this season out of them. And then they're older next year, and maybe you have to cut them, and it really kills your cap then. So,
A lot of things to keep in mind heading into 2021, and there's certainly a lot of opportunity this upcoming season for things to shift around. Lots of change likely happening, so make sure you're checking out Packers News for all of your Packers coverage. We'll be covering everything as training camp continues into the regular season. That's going to do it for us today, everyone. On behalf of Tom, I'm Olivia. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.